Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Northern Virginia at a briefing with the Aerospace Industries Association of America's president and CEO, Eric Fanning, former United States Army Secretary. You're one of the most extraordinary people because you have background in Army, Navy, as well as in the Air Force. Eric, thanks very much. Great presentation about the new priorities, the rebranding of the organization that you've been leading here now for more than a year. Tell us a little bit about why the rebranding was an important element in sort of re-gearing the organization and the institution for the future.
Well, we turn 100 this year. It's our centennial year, and that seemed as good a time as any to look at our branding. And branding is so much more than a logo, of course. It's really a strategic exercise to think about who you are, how you communicate that, and how you get done what you want to get done. And so we took the team through a pretty long, extensive exercise that led to a new logo. We'll have new social platforms, new website, what have you. But it also made us refine who we are and what it is we want to accomplish on behalf of our industry.
And you started that off by giving sort of the list of the 4 big priorities for the year. Walk us through those priorities and give us a little bit of specific examples. You talked a little bit about budgetary stability. You talked about regulations, and I'll dive a little bit deeper into the whole smart regulation piece of it. But walk us through sort of the big muscle movements you guys want to execute over the coming year.
So it's 4 main buckets that really have been our go-to foundational strategic priorities. The first is advocating for a budget that funds the things our agencies have been asked to do. That's NASA, NOAA, FAA, and DOD. I know from my own time in government what it's like when you're asked to do more than you're given resource to accomplish it. Second is we're looking at all manners of things to make sure that our industry, our country, is as competitive as possible and that there aren't any unnecessary barriers or that we're not supporting our countries, our companies, our industries in ways that other countries are doing for their industries. Third is making sure we have the right regulation in place, and that increasingly means risk-based regulations, standard-based regulations, performance-based regulations, output-based regulations that can grow and move with technology as it iterates faster and faster and faster. And then fourth, none of this matters if we don't have the right workforce in place. And our companies strive to find the right workers year over year. And so that means getting kids in elementary school interested in STEM to working on accreditation and learning-based programs for people that are already in the workforce.
When you talked about regulation there, and so much came up in the press conference that you had with a Washington-based journalist, but also Doug Kammerer of the Wall Street Journal joined remotely and was his normal provocative and amusing self. But walk us through on the regulatory side of it, right? The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty has been undone. That gives opportunity for the United States to develop the kind of weaponry that Russia and China have been investing in. On the other hand, the missile technology control regime, there have been a lot of questions about whether in a modern, automated, unmanned future that we're going to is unnecessarily restrictive. You have the conventional arms transfer policy, which Remy Nathan, the Vice President for International Affairs, has been enormously successful in sort of driving that debate as AIA and the industry and government have worked to reshape it, stretching back to the Bush administration on through the Obama years and now in the Trump administration. As you look at smart regulations on each one of these things, where do you think some of these balance points are? As you're going to an unmanned drone future, there are a whole series of regs, particularly for large passenger, the kind of future that so many companies are working toward right now. Walk us through each one of these segments and where you see opportunity and what might be some clever ways of thinking about it as somebody who sat on the other side of the table as a service secretary, as a deputy, and in other jobs where you had to worry about force protection and force defense.
So that's a long question. There are all sorts of areas, regimes, regulations that didn't imagine the technology that's developing today. And so our focus is to make sure that we protect our safety and our security first and foremost, but that we account for new technologies that are out there. I don't think anybody imagined when we were defining what a cruise missile was that we would have these large-scale autonomous drones carrying cargo across the continent or across oceans. And those definitions are butting up against each other. And so we want to see if we can't refine some of these definitions and regulations to account for these technological changes so that we still have a focus on safety and security, but we allow for innovation. going forward, they need to be regulations that recognize that technology will continue to change. If we regulate in the old way, we'll never catch up with the development of technology today, and so we will stifle innovation and competition or cooperation in the United States.
You worked with the department, the administration just released its artificial intelligence strategy, which folks have been calling for some time, from sort of a national vision on this, given the Chinese have their strategy. We also have the administration trying to put a priority on cybersecurity, although I was talking to a CEO friend of mine yesterday and said, look, it's still not getting as much attention as it deserves, and there still isn't as much progress on that. And of course, then we have the perennial issue of sort of working with the department on progress payment rules. But, bring us up to speed on each one of these three elements, how AIA is working with the department to try to advance cybersecurity, work on AI, but also then on all of the blocking and tackling stuff that Secretary Lord is trying to do, in sort of, both improving the relationship with industry and the department, but on the other hand, also holding contractors accountable, which is kind of always a delicate balance.
You're going to have to walk me through those three again as we go through this.
I figured that you're one of the people I could give a three-part question to, and you can handle all three parts of it.
Well, my mind was racing on the AI part. I think it's exciting to see the focus that's coming on AI, because AI could be everything if you don't put some definition to it. And if we don't put some definition to it, we won't know how to invest in it as a country. AIA is not doing anything specifically on AI. We use it as an example of where we will not excel as a nation if we're not all working together. It means all the parts of government and the private sector. And so it has to start with some definition, some goals, some strategy. And so that's an important first step, what we've seen come out of the White House, what we've seen come out of the Department of Defense.
Where do you see for the cyber strategy, though, is something that is important for each one of the companies, but there's been that yin and yang tension where on the one hand, companies want to sort of not have a directive solution on them, but now the department increasingly is saying, hey, look, as Secretary Shanahan said, we're going to use this as a source selection criteria. We need everybody to do a better job. It has hit some smaller contractors, but costs have gone up at bigger contractors as well. Talk to us a little bit about the conversation and some of the ideas you're forwarding to the department as it works to do something which is, I think everybody recognizes a long way to go and is going to be very costly.
I think everybody recognizes how important this is in government, in industry. Perhaps catching up a little bit late collectively to the threat and what we need to do about it. We don't think we'll get to a solution if it's prescriptive. It has to be risk-based. You can't regulate this or audit this in the same way that we have done things in the past. It's too enormous of an issue, and it's too fast-changing of an issue. It's so important to industry and to government that they are collaborating together to figure out how to do this and get some assurance all the way up through the supply chain to the big platforms that we're delivering to the department.
Two trade questions, one on China, the other one on NAFTA, or the USMCA as it's now, or may not be referred to, depending on how Congress looks at it. First on China, you have an unusual membership base, right? I mean, one part of the membership base certainly is the benefits from the threat of China. On the other hand, there's another large series of your membership on the commercial side of things, where China is actually one of the most important and vibrant commercial aerospace markets, certainly. Bring us up to speed. I mean, the president is still, there is that tariff threat that exists that's right around the corner. Walk us through where we are right now and what are the implications for industry and your membership base should those tougher tariffs end up becoming a reality if Premier Xi and President Trump can agree on something that averts that March 1 deadline.
Our industry is diverse. It's incredibly diverse, and some members look at China as a market, some don't. But all of them understand the unfair practices of the Chinese, particularly as it relates to intellectual property IP. Whether you're a defense contractor or on the civil aviation or space side, the Chinese have been coming after that IP for years. And so they understand why the administration has targeted those practices in China. We hope that we can come to a solution through negotiation instead of tariffs, because we're afraid that will have a ripple effect, particularly on our supply chain. The defense companies, in some cases, share supply chain industrial-based members with the civil aviation side, and those small companies might have a harder time surviving trade issues or tariffs if they're levied.
Let's go to USMCA. Obviously, Canada and Mexico are critical parts of the U.S. industrial base, whether for aerospace control only, wiring harnesses, all the engine work and other stuff that happens in Canada. We moved from NAFTA to the USMCA, but the USMCA hasn't been approved, and there are concerns that it may not be approved. So what are the potential implications there of having moved away from one regulatory trade regime and then not quite moved to the other one? I mean, have you and your membership considered what are the implications here?
So the AIA is American companies, of course, but they are globally sourced, they market globally, and in the absence of these types of regimes, it does cause problems for them in terms of their supply chain and also their market. And so we advocate for these regimes, either replacing them, new ones, whatever it is, to have them in place for some stability, predictability in order for our companies to do business.
Budget issue, and one last question on workforce. On the budget, you mentioned 3 to 5% is important. That's what the National Defense Strategy Commission looked at and said, hey, look, we need to have a more robust defense on a sustained basis. But there is a concern that that money is not going to be there, particularly beyond 2020. On the one hand, your charge from your membership is advocate for more resources. On the other hand, do you think it's time to also have sort of build a plan B so that the industry copes for something a little bit less in a more organized manner, even if that includes doing that in concert with the government, to make sure that if there is a contraction, that it's a managed contraction instead of something that is potentially more damaging than not?
When we talk about budgets, we don't just talk about top line. We talk about predictability and stability. We want a process that delivers the budget before the year starts, and we want to be able to have some sense of what the budget's going to be into the future for exactly as you say, so we can plan around it. So that's important. All companies in the private sector and all parts of government, in my experience, in my career, have plan Bs, plan Cs, plan Ds, and that's particularly true in this environment because you can't bet year to year what your budget's going to be, and that makes it very hard to plan, makes it very hard to get the best out of the programs, and makes it very hard to get the most out of the taxpayer dollars. So we don't just talk about what the top line is, we talk about needing to have some stability to the process and predictability to what that budget's going to be off into the future.
And you suffered that repetitive stress disorder when you were in the department. You were much taller then. I'm just kidding. Last question. You're somebody who devoted his life to government service, whether you were up on the Hill or whether in each of the military services, as we said. I mean, very few people had Air Force, Navy, and as well as Army Secretary experience on that. Are you concerned about the morale, not just the morale of folks in government service after this shutdown, where an extraordinary number of people are second-guessing their decision to go into government, and how important that service is? Are you worried that the best and the brightest will decide that government service isn't for them at the end of the day, with damaging repercussions across the economy and national security?
It's been amazing to me my entire career, the perseverance of the civilian workforce and their dedication and the fact that people are willing to put up with the vagaries and the inconsistencies of being in the workforce. This was the longest shutdown we've ever had, but it's not the first perturbation we put the workforce through. We have the continuing resolutions. We've had shutdowns before. They get caught in all sorts of political traps. We've got too many of them. They don't work very hard. They shouldn't get a pay raise. We freeze their salary. Historically, we treat the civilian workforce really poorly, and we rely on it. I mean, one of the things that comes out of the shutdown, I think, is that people start to realize all the services and things they depend on that aren't there anymore because the people aren't there anymore. But it is hard when you skip a paycheck and then you're almost about to skip another paycheck, even with the guarantee that the money's going to come back. So I do worry about that. It's terrible for the morale to have this inconsistency and lack of predictability in your career and your life.
Eric Fanning, President and CEO of the Aerospace Industries Association. Thanks very much. Best of luck on the 100th anniversary celebrations. Beautiful new logo and great priorities.
Great. Thank you very much. Good to see you again, Vago.